What if everything you inherited was already on the verge of being taken away? Before she even knew how to spell her own name, the land had already whispered it into the trees, into the riverbeds, into the red soil soaked in silence and secrets. She was only a child then, a girl with wide, wondering eyes and a silence too heavy for her years, standing barefoot at the edge of 2 wooden coffins and a shallow grave. Rain poured like grief from the sky, and the village, cloaked in shadow. And superstition murmured behind her. They never said it aloud, but the air carried it. She is cursed. And so they sent her away, far from the hills of Umuaya, where drums once beat in her honor, far from the stories in the firelight and the ancestors who spoke through flame. They banished her to Lagos, a place where horns replaced birdsong. And love came with conditions. In that city of concrete and strangers, she became small, a ghost drifting through her aunt's house, a whisper in a world that never called her name with kindness. But the land never forgot her. Even when everyone else did, the land remembered. Every few moons, a letter would find her, no return address, no stamp, only the trembling handwriting of Papa Connell. And inside, always the same closing words, tucked into each envelope like a prophecy. One day, the land will call you home. You must answer, or everything will be lost. She never understood what it meant, but she never missed a word. She folded those letters like prayers, and kept them hidden beneath her bed, ink smudged with time and tears. Then, one day, came the knock. A man in a suit too sharp for the neighborhood, carrying a folder thick with dust and declarations. "Miss Adaeze Okafor," he said. "You've inherited an entire village." Just like that, the earth beneath her shifted, because this wasn't just about land. It wasn't just inheritance. It was about memory, legacy, power, and a village already locked in a quiet war for its soul. She didn't know it yet, but her return would stir more than just dust. Some would welcome her with open arms, others with knives sharpened by generations of resentment. But the drums of destiny had started, and what they didn't know, what she didn't yet know, was that the battle for Umuaya had just begun. She was born between whispers and warnings, under a sky that rumbled long before the storm began. Her name was Adaeze, but in the beginning, she was just a girl with wide, wondering eyes and a spirit the world was too careless to understand. Her parents, they said, were good people, healers, peacemakers, carriers of old wisdom, the kind of people the village only remembered once they were gone. And gone they were, swallowed in a tragedy that never quite made sense. A crash, they said. But even as a child, she knew that some things fall apart not by accident, but by intention. She stood at their graves with fists clenched and lips trembling, the red soil clinging to her toes like memory. She didn't cry, not because she was strong, but because sorrow had robbed her even of that. The elders said nothing, but the silence around her was not quiet. It hissed. "She is cursed," some whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. And so, before the wound had even scabbed, they sent her away, not to family who loved her, but to relatives who accepted her out of obligation, like a chore passed down. Lagos became her exile. No drums there, no firelight storytelling, no sacred trees or morning libations. Just traffic, concrete, and the tired rituals of survival. Her aunt was the kind of woman who had buried softness a long time ago. Her eyes saw Adaeze, but they never looked at her. Her home was full of rules and empty of warmth. Adaeze learned quickly how to mop floors in silence, how to swallow questions, how to apologize for things that were never her fault. She became a ghost that dusted windows and fetched water, a name only called when something was needed. Her school was a world where she was present but invisible, always a few inches outside the circle. In her heart, she built a fortress of stillness, and it grew tall. But the land, her true land, never let go. Every few moons, a letter would arrive. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was from Papa Connell, the old man who had once lifted her onto his lap and told her stories that stretched longer than night. She barely remembered his face, but his words felt like home. The letters were not long, but they carried the weight of generations. "Adaeze," they began. "You are not forgotten." And always they ended with the same haunting promise. One day, the land will call you home. You must answer, or everything will be lost. She didn't understand what it meant, not truly, but she never missed a word. She hid each letter beneath her mattress, reading them over and over, the ink smudging as the years passed. As she grew, her questions deepened. Why had she never been brought back for the festivals, the funerals, the naming ceremonies? Why did her bloodline, once so honored, now feel erased? And who, really, was her father? This man who spoke little and kept many secrets. There were nights when she dreamed of fire and shadowy figures. In some dreams, her mother reached for her but vanished just before their fingers touched. In others, she was running through the bush, chased by faceless people who called her name with voices full of malice. In the world outside, she became tall, quiet, and serious. Her teachers called her disciplined, her peers called her strange. But inside, she was a girl building bridges back to a place she barely remembered. The city taught her how to survive, but it never gave her a sense of who she was. Her identity hung like an unfinished sentence. She wore uniforms, ate fast food, memorized the rules of a world that didn't know her lineage. And yet, when the moon was full, she would find a quiet window and stare at it for hours, as if it might whisper something. Because deep down, she believed the land still remembered her name, and one day it would call. The letter arrived like thunder disguised in paper, folded neatly in a worn envelope, delivered not by courier, but by a man in a well-ironed suit who did not belong to the dusty Lega Street Adaeze called home. He stood with poise, the air around him thick with tradition and tension. "Miss Adaeze Okafor," he said, "you are the sole heir to the late Chief Elisa Okafor's estate, which includes the village of Umuaya." She stared blankly. A village? An entire people? What did it mean to inherit more than land? What did it mean to carry a name that others still feared or honored? When she returned, the village did not cheer. It stared. Eyes followed her through every dusty lane. Some whispered hope, some whispered curses. A few children smiled. One boy ran. Old women crossed themselves. And yet, one man welcomed her with open arms, Papa Connell. His eyes knew her, even when she had forgotten herself. He called her Daughter of the Drum. But not everyone agreed. Madame Ngozi, sharp-tongued and iron-willed, called for proof. "Let her prove herself," she snapped. Blood alone is not enough. They demanded tradition. They called for rights. No one rules where the ancestors have not spoken. As Adaeze immersed herself in village life, drinking from the sacred, spring, dancing in the moonlight, listening to stories carved in elders' wrinkles, she began to remember things she had never known. Chisholm, her childhood friend, now grown and hardened by farming and politics, stood by her side. But behind the laughter, behind the smiles, shadows moved. One night, she found an old journal, her father's. Its pages told of a village sitting on wealth beyond soil, oil, gold, rare herbs, and something older, spiritual power. He had fought to protect it and paid the price. Madame Ngozi, it turned out, had been selling secrets, trading land rights for power. Corporations circled like vultures. Ghosts whispered. The ancestors stirred. The fight was not just legal, it was spiritual. She had to walk fire, give blood, speak to the earth itself. She had to endure poison in her food, lies in her name, fire at her doorstep. Even Chisholm faltered. "Maybe you weren't meant to lead," he said. She left. But only her body, her spirit stayed. Then little Emmy came running with a letter from Papa Kono, hidden under the sacred tree. The truth glowed from the parchment. She returned to the square, lifted her head, and faced them. "You ruled with fear," she told Madame Ngozi. "I will lead with truth." The drums began again. This time, for her, Amuwagia changed, slowly but surely. The well ran clean. The school reopened. The goats no longer ran wild, except one always following Emmy. The land breathed again. Adaeze, now leader, planted a tree where her father once stood. "This," she said, "is for tomorrow." She had come as a stranger. She stayed as a daughter, and she rose as a leader. Because legacy is not what you inherit. It is what you protect, what you rebuild, and what you leave behind. What would you do if you inherited a kingdom? Would you fight to keep it? The bus groaned to a halt at the edge of the village, its tires kicking up the red dust of forgotten stories. As Adaeze stepped down, the sign greeted her with painted words that almost mocked her uncertainty. "Welcome to Umuhiath, land of peace." But the air told a different story. It was thick, not with heat, but with eyes. Curious, cold, watching. Children clung to their mothers. Elders exchanged glances. Whispers followed her like restless spirits. She walked slowly, suitcase in hand, heart pounding like the village drums she hadn't heard since she was a child. She did not recognize the buildings, but the earth beneath her feet hummed like an old lullaby. The silence was loud. Then, from the shadows of a clay compound, a familiar figure stepped forward. Wrinkled hands, back slightly bent, but eyes as clear as the river at dawn. "You've returned," Papa Kono said, arms open. His embrace was dry and strong, like sun-baked wood, and in that moment, something in her exhaled. "You carry your father's silence," he whispered, "and your mother's fire." He brought her to the compound that once belonged to her family. It was older now, cracked in places, but it stood. Inside, she found fragments of her past, a broken mortar, her mother's headscarf, a rusted bell. They held no power alone, but together they sang. That night, a gathering was called. A welcome, though not all came willingly. There were faces that smiled without warmth, nods that came too slow. Among them, a man in polished slippers and a voice that oozed honey and venom. He called himself Counselor Oji, but everyone knew him as Madame Ngozi's shadow, a man who made enemies vanish through paperwork and persuasion. He spoke in riddles, praised the ancestors, and questioned her right to lead in the same breath. But not all was stone. From the crowd, a laugh rang out, Chisholm. He was broader now, sun-darkened, hands calloused, but his grin was still crooked like it had always been. "You still hate palm wine?" he teased. She smiled, a little. He took her to the edge of the village, where the baobab still stood. They sat beneath it as they had once done as children, and for a while, time folded. But the peace was brief. That night, after the dance and the food and the fire, a secret meeting was held in the elder's hut. Candles flickered. Names were whispered. Plans were made. Some said she was not the true heir. Some said her blood was tainted by the city. And some, like Madame Ngozi, said nothing at all, just smiled and watched. The village was not ready to be led by a ghost from the past. But Adaeze had not come to beg. She had come to reclaim. And the land, though silent, was listening. It started with a cough in the wall. The sound led her to a crack behind the old family altar, and behind the crack was a box, wrapped in cloth the color of the sky just before it rains. Inside the box lay her father's journal, brittle with age but burning with truth. Adaeze opened it slowly, afraid of what she might find, and more afraid of what she might understand. The pages were heavy with ink and urgency. Her father had written in Igbo English, even in symbols she did not yet recognize. He had chronicled the land not as a place, but as a being, living, breathing, waiting. Beneath the soil, he wrote, there were more than cassava and yam. There was gold buried in old streams, oil in pockets beneath the sacred grove, herbs that could heal or curse depending on the hand that used them, and something else, something older, something no company or contractor could ever buy. This land is not just rich, he wrote, it is holy. He had tried to shield it, to protect its soul from exploitation. But whispers of wealth are louder than the wisdom of the dead, and the whispers had reached people who had no business listening. Madame Ngozi had known. That much was now clear. She had stood beside her father at council meetings, smiling in agreement while selling secrets in silence. She had invited foreign companies in, under the guise of progress, corporations with smooth suits and silent deals, government men who arrived with charm and left with deeds. Adaeze flipped through page after page, each one another dagger of betrayal. Her father had fought quietly, using knowledge, not fists. But knowledge had not saved him. In the end, he was buried with his secrets, until now. That night, she went to the sacred grove alone. The moon was swollen and bright, and the wind moved through the trees like breath. She sat before the baobab tree and spoke not as a leader, not as a daughter, but as a child of the land. She asked for a sign. Something stirred. A cold shiver wrapped itself around her spine, and suddenly she saw a figure, or perhaps only felt. It was tall, faceless, clothed in the dust of ancestors and the scent of burning herbs. Its voice was not a sound, but a memory. It did not threaten, it warned. What they dig, they will awaken. What they take, they cannot carry. She blinked and it was gone, but the feeling remained. The land had spoken. Now it was up to her to listen. Days passed. Adaeze could no longer walk the village without feeling the pull beneath her feet. Children played atop sacred stones. Foreign surveyors inspected hills with quiet nods. A new road was being marked by men who refused to say who had hired them. Even Chisholm began to distance himself, his smile now thin, his words uncertain. Maybe they're right, he said once. Maybe this is bigger than you. But Adaeze had made her choice. She would not run. She would not sell. She would fight. The battle would not be with bullets or blades, but with truth, with proof, with spirit. She gathered the journal, the letters from Papa Kono, the ancient symbols etched. In the altar, she met with Papa Kono again and told him everything. He nodded slowly. Your father, he said. He saw this coming. He planted the tree, but he knew you would water it. Together, they went to the elders. She stood before them, spine straight, voice steady. She spoke of what lay beneath the village, not just the wealth, but the responsibility. We are not owners of this land, she said. We are its guardians. Some listened, some mocked. Madame Ngozi smiled the entire time. You have spirit, she said, but spirit won't stop a bulldozer. Adaeze stepped closer. Then I'll lie in the path of one. The room fell silent. The elders agreed to wait, to think, to pray. But Adaeze knew there was no time. That night, as she walked home, she saw a flame in the distance. Her family's compound was burning. The fire danced like a demon, bright and cruel. Someone had sent a message, but they had also made a mistake. Fire could not break her. It could only purify. The next morning, barefoot and covered in ash, she stood at the village square. "This is not a fight for land," she said. "This is a fight for soul." And in that moment, she was no longer the orphan girl who had come with questions. She was the woman who would answer for generations. It began not with shouting, but with paper, forged, stamped, and delivered in silence. Madame Ngozi's allies, slick in their collared shirts and thick with entitlement, produced a new will, a version that conveniently erased Adaeze's name, and claimed her father had changed his mind before death, leaving the estate to a distant cousin. The villagers were confused. Some murmured in support, others raised eyebrows, and confusion is a seed that grows quickly in soil watered by power. The elders gathered. Documents were examined, stamps compared, names questioned. But in Umuahia, paper holds no weight without the blessing of tradition. And so the council ruled that Adaeze's claim could not stand unless she fulfilled the Chisung, rites of succession, a ritual reserved for true heirs, one not performed in decades, one rumored to be dangerous, even deadly. She stood before them, fists clenched at her sides, eyes steady. "If this is what the land asks, then I will answer." She was led to the sacred grove at dawn, barefoot, dressed in white, her face marked with chalk and ash. The women sang low, mournful songs as they tied the red cloth around her waist. The ritual required her to walk a path of thorns and flame, to kneel at the ancestor stone, to speak the names of those who came before without hesitation. A single misstep, they said, and the spirits would reject her. She did not flinch. She walked through the fire. She named them. Her voice did not shake, and when she finished, the wind changed. The trees stirred. Even the silence seemed to bow. The next day, the elders confirmed her passage. "The land knows you," they said, "but the people must still decide." That was the harder fight, because a village is not led by ritual alone. It is held by trust, and trust does not come easy. Madame Ngozi began her campaign. She spread whispers like disease, that Adaeze brought bad luck, that the compound fire was her own doing, that she was a witch trained in the city to come back and steal the land. Her food was poisoned. She survived. Her name was dragged through the mud of gossip and old grief. Even a goat was mysteriously slaughtered, its blood smeared at the entrance of her hut. She woke to find the elders staring, judgment heavy in their silence. And still, she did not bend. She swept her threshold clean. She stood in the square and listened. She did not shout. She served water at funerals. She danced at weddings. She helped lift wood at the rebuilding of the school. Slowly, hearts began to turn, but not all. Chisum, once her fiercest defender, now walked with hesitation. "It's too much," he said one evening. "They fear you more than they trust you." She looked at him and saw the weight he carried, the pressure to conform, the fear of being on the wrong side. "So you'll walk away too?" she asked. He said nothing, and his silence was louder than any answer. That night, she sat alone at the edge of the river. She asked the water if she was enough, if blood and spirit and suffering were not already proof. She cried not as a child, but as a woman learning that strength can be a lonely road. The next morning, she was gone. The village woke to find her hut empty, her name unanswered. Some called her a coward. Some mourned. Papa Cunnel said nothing, only closed his door and lit incense. 3 days passed. Then, on the 4th, little Emmy ran into the village, shouting, "She's coming back." And she came, walking slowly, proudly, covered in ash. Her eyes were clear. In her hand, the deed to the land, dug from beneath the ancestor tree, wrapped in her father's journal, and sealed with the sacred cord. Papa Cunnel walked beside her, holding the ancestral staff. "You want proof?" she asked. "Here it is." She turned to Chisum. And if you still doubt me, walk away. But don't ever say I didn't fight for you." The crowd gathered. Even Madame Ngozi stood at the edge. There were no more whispers, just silence. The elders stepped forward. One by one, they touched her shoulder. The vote was cast. The rite was fulfilled. Adaeze was declared rightful leader. In that moment, she did not cheer. She wept. And the village, finally, wept with her. 3 days passed in silence, and still the villagers whispered about the girl who had walked into their lives with fire in her eyes and vanished without a word. Some said she had fled, ashamed and broken. Others believed she had gone to the city to surrender her claim and start over far from the judgment of the ancestors. But Papa Kunnel remained quiet, sweeping the compound each morning as if waiting for dust to carry a message. On the 4th day, as the morning mist still hugged, the rooftops and the chickens had not yet begun to stir, a small voice echoed through the village square. It was little Emmy, barefoot and breathless, his tiny hands clutching something wrapped in cloth. "She's coming back," he cried over and over. "Adaeze is coming back." And when she did, the village stood still. She was not the same girl who had walked away. Her feet were caked in ash, her eyes lined with soot, but there was clarity in her gaze, as if the silence had sharpened her soul. She walked straight to the square, her pace steady, her hands calm. Beside her was Papa Kunnel, and in his hands, the ancestral staff, the carved symbol of leadership, long buried, now returned. Adaeze held a bundle close to her chest. When she reached the center, she knelt and slowly unwrapped it. Inside was a faded letter and an object wrapped in goat hide. She lifted the letter first. "This was written by my father," she said. "It was hidden beneath the ancestor tree, sealed in the earth. He knew they would come for this land. He knew there would be a day when his child would have to finish what he started." Her voice did not tremble. She stood and held the object. In her other hand, a bronze emblem shaped like a kola nut split in two, the traditional seal of the Okafor bloodline, lost for years, now shining faintly in the sunlight. "This is the true mark of our lineage. You cannot forge what the earth remembers." The villagers gasped. Even the oldest elders leaned forward. Then, from the crowd, Chisholm stepped out. He did not speak at first. His eyes searched hers, as if looking for the pieces of the girl he once knew. "I was wrong," he said at last. "I let fear choose for me. But I am choosing now." He dropped to one knee. "You are our voice, and I will follow it." Others began to murmur, some bowing their heads, some stepping closer. Madame Ngozi, arms folded, stood still. Her mouth curled into something between disdain and disbelief. "So, you found a trinket," she said. "Words from the dead don't rule the living." Adaeze looked at her and smiled softly, not with pride, but with the peace of one who knows who she is. "Then let the living decide." The council was called. The villagers gathered again beneath the ancient tree where judgments were once made and justice had once been sacred. The staff was placed at the center, beside the emblem, the letter, and the journal. One by one, elders spoke. One by one, hands were raised. And when the final vote was cast, the drummers began. This time, not in mourning, but in welcome. Adaeze stepped forward and took the staff in her hands. She walked to the sacred stone at the heart of the village and lit a small fire using the herbs her mother once used for blessings. Smoke curled into the sky, and the crowd fell into silence. She dug a shallow hole beside the stone and planted a tree, a young iroko, small now but destined to rise tall and wide with time. "This," she said, "is for tomorrow, for every child who doesn't know where they come from, for every voice that was once silenced." The fire crackled beside her. the tree rooted beneath her, the people standing around her, no longer doubting, no longer divided. The land, it seemed, was breathing again. And Adaeze, no longer orphan, no longer outsider, had become the story herself, the drumbeat in the soil, the fire in the wind, the living answer to her ancestors' prayers. The drums did not stop the day she was declared leader. They echoed into the night, not in celebration, but in remembrance. The village of Umuahia had chosen, not with blind trust, but with weary hearts that had watched generations rise and fall like the sun behind the hills. Adaeze stood beneath the great Iroko tree, the ancestral staff in her hand, her mother's cloth tied across her shoulders, her father's journal pressed close to her side. The air was thick with dust and change. It did not happen overnight. Power never moves gently. At first, the people watched her with cautious eyes, waiting for the fire in her to fade. But it didn't. She worked. She listened. She learned. She sat with the elders at dusk and asked them for stories. She stood with the children at dawn and asked them for dreams. The village was not rebuilt in one grand act, but in many small, quiet ones. A new well was dug where the old one had gone dry. A schoolhouse reopened with blackboards reclaimed from storage and walls painted by the villagers themselves. The market square, once choked by silence and suspicion, began to hum again with trade, with voices, with life. Adaeze did not rule from above. She walked among them. She planted crops beside the women, sang lullabies to children as they fell, asleep in their mother's arms, and danced when the rains returned, her feet bare against the red clay, her laughter unguarded. The goats still wandered too far. A generator still coughed on its worst days. Some roofs still leaked, and some wounds, though hidden, still bled quietly beneath the surface. Forgiveness, she learned, did not bloom in every heart at the same time, and not everyone stayed. Madame Ngozi left quietly one morning, her compound stripped of power, her name no longer feared, but also no longer cursed. Some said she moved to the city. Others believed she remained nearby, watching from the trees. Adaeze did not chase her. She did not need to. Her battle had never been against one woman. It had been against forgetting, against silence, against the slow, quiet death of a people's identity. One evening, as the sun spilled gold over the hills, little Emmy ran to her side and tugged at her wrapper. "You said the tree was for tomorrow," he asked. "When is tomorrow?" She smiled and lifted him into her arms. "Tomorrow," she said, "is already growing." And indeed, the tree they had planted now stood taller than a man, its leaves rustling like applause in the evening breeze. Beneath it, the village gathered for naming ceremonies, for songs, for stories, once silenced and now spoken boldly. A painting of Adaeze's parents was hung in the school, her mother holding a calabash of herbs, her father with the ancestral staff, their eyes painted soft and strong. Adaeze visited often, not to mourn, but to remember that her fight had not started with her, and it would not end with her either. Legacy, she realized, was not a trophy. It was a duty, a living, breathing thing that required tending, like a field, like a wound, like a child. She stood once more in the village square, just as she had when the fire tried to claim her, when the lies threatened to bury her. But now there was no doubt in the eyes around her, no distance in the way they stood. She was theirs, and they were hers. She raised the staff once more, not for ceremony, but to remind them. "Inheriting a legacy is easy," she said. "Keeping it demands everything." And in the wind that passed through the trees, in the fire that still glowed gently at the shrine, in the rhythm of the children's feet as they danced through the dust, the ancestors answered, not with words, but with peace. She came to the village carrying only questions, a suitcase, and a past buried under silence. She was the girl they once called cursed, the child no one reached for, the outsider who returned not with demands, but with a quiet fire. They had sent her away when she was small, but the land never forgot her name. Through betrayal, trials, and the weight of her father's legacy, she found her voice. She faced forged documents and poisoned words, rituals meant to break her spirit, and wounds that stretched far beyond blood. But she did not bend, and when they burned what she had, she rose from the ashes not in anger, but in purpose. Adaeze did not just inherit land. She inherited a people, a history, a duty. And step by step, choice by choice, she transformed from the girl who watched from doorways into the woman who stood at the center. She fought not just to prove she belonged, but to remind them all that they did too, that their stories mattered, that their land was more than soil. It was memory, voice, and spirit. She built not just schools and wells, but trust. She didn't erase the past. She honored it. And in doing so, she turned pain into power. She planted trees where fire had once raged, taught children the names of ancestors once silenced, and reminded the village of the strength found in stillness, in roots, in truth. Some scars remained. Not every heart softened. Not every wrong was righted. But the village stood, breathing, alive, united. Because Adaeze had not come to lead from above, she came to rise with them. And in rising, she became more than heir, more than daughter. She became legacy made flesh, a living answer to the prayers of those long gone. She was no longer just the orphan. She was the leader, the seed, the storm, the storyteller. And as the drums echoed into dusk, one truth remained clear. Inheriting a legacy is easy, but keeping it, holding it with love, leading it with courage, and passing it on with grace, that demands everything.